Have you ever considered making a podcast? Well, Spotify has a great platform that lets you make them very easily, distribute them everywhere. You can even earn money while doing so, and it's all in one place. And the best part, it's all for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and it's really simple to get started. So you record and edit your podcast right from your phone, your computer, whichever one that you like. And then when you publish them, they distribute your podcast directly to Spotify and also everywhere else that podcasts are heard. You can do video podcasts, you can interact with your audience with Q&As and polls. And once they're up and running, like I mentioned before, you can even earn money through your podcast in a variety of ways through things like ads and podcast subscriptions. And of course, it's totally free to use. There is no catch. When I started Plant School, I used Spotify for Podcasters, and I continue to use it because I love it. It's super easy to use, and it gives me everything that I need as a podcaster. So if you have ever wanted to start your own podcast, I highly recommend that you try out Spotify for Podcasters. You can download the app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started. Welcome to the Plant School podcast. I'm Rachel, and here we learn about plants, how to care for them, how they work, and I keep it simple and taught in a way that anyone from beginner to expert can enjoy. Join me in Plant School. Hello and welcome to Plant School. We are on episode 99. Can you believe that? No, I can't. I'm just talking to myself here. No, I cannot. It's exciting to me that this podcast has been around that long and to have so many amazing listeners tuning in each week. I really appreciate you being here. I've mentioned this in my other episodes before this one, but episode 100, we are doing a giveaway, so this is officially the last week to enter. So if you haven't already, enter right now. It is your last chance. If somehow you do miss the cutoff, like I've already recorded me selecting a winner, I'm going to enter you into the next giveaway, okay? So even if you don't win this one, don't be alarmed, you can win the next one. And what are we giving away? I'm giving away free plants. I'm giving away free Plant School t-shirts. I also have other plant-related shirts that don't say Plant School on them if that's, your jam. And yeah, it's going to be really fun. It's just to kind of celebrate and say thank you to you as a listener. All you have to do to enter is share it with someone that you think would be interested in the podcast, and then message me on Instagram at TennyPlants, TENNEY plants, or you can email me at tennyplants@gmail. Whichever you prefer, just share it and let me know. But let's get on to our episode. Today's a fun one. So I don't know about you guys and where you're living. I know that there are a lot of you that are kind of just all around the world. Majority of you, when I last looked at my stats, are in the US. And for a lot of us here in the US, it has gotten cold. And I thought that this would be the perfect time to go over how to prepare houseplants for winter time, for cold temperatures. I apologize to those of you listening that are maybe in the southern hemisphere, those of you in Australia, things like that. Because this is probably the time of year it's getting warmer for you, right? Your summer's starting. You're the opposite of how we are over here in the northern hemisphere. But for the majority of you listening, it's getting cold. And it's definitely getting cold where I am here in northern Utah. And so I thought I would record this episode to kind of help us transition to wintertime, because there are some things to consider when you have houseplants and it gets colder, the seasons change. A lot of this is kind of intuitive, but it's very helpful to go over, and maybe you're really unfamiliar with plants. This is kind of what Plant School is really all about, is me being here to help all ranges of plant lovers, those who are beginners, those who are really into it. So this can be a reminder for some and maybe new information for others. And as a note, these are general guidelines, so it may differ slightly from plant to plant, but for the most part, all plants can benefit from thinking about these things that I'm going to be going over. First things first is I want to talk about what changes you might notice to your plants in the wintertime, and maybe some of you have already started to notice this. So just be aware that in the wintertime, some houseplants may drop a few leaves. And this is due to the lower light levels that they are getting because the sun is not up for as many hours in the day as it is in the spring and summertime. I would say the most common plant to do this would be your ficuses. That includes fiddle leaf figs, Benjamin ficus, because ficuses are notoriously just dropping leaves whenever they feel stressed out. Maybe some of you can relate to that. When you feel stressed, other things in your life just feel like they're falling apart. But anyways, another thing you might notice during the winter time is that your houseplants will have slower growth because there's not as much sun in the day, not as much warmth. It can result in a slower growth rate. So don't be expecting them to be growing like crazy because that's just not realistic in the winter time. So now that we have that in mind, let's go over the things of how do we prepare our houseplants to thrive in the winter. There's quite a few things, and we will start with number one. This is probably the most important one too, is to cut back on watering. So like I mentioned, you're getting less light in the winter, therefore you need less water. Your plant isn't photosynthesizing as much and using as much energy, therefore it's not uptaking as much water as quickly as it once was. So just make sure to check the soil before you water. Your finger is honestly the best moisture meter out there. Some of you may even have one of those fancy moisture meters. I love to just use my finger. So go ahead and stick your finger in the soil. If it's wet, don't water it. If it's feeling really dry, give it some water. If you continue to water on a normal schedule without really considering that your plants are getting less light, root rot is pretty likely to occur, and we do not want that because that can kill your plant, and we're not about that. There's also like a lot of fun family holidays in the wintertime. There's Thanksgiving, there's Christmas, families are usually getting together for that. So if you are going out of town, you can, give your houseplants a good soak, and honestly, they should be good for well over a week. Our sunlight hours have been dwindling, and we just left on a trip, and I think they went I wasn't gone for 2 full weeks, but they went 2 full weeks between watering, and they were completely fine. And it's just because their uptake of that water has really slowed down ever since it's gotten cold. So just keep that in mind when you're leaving. You can soak them. Just make sure when you come back that you are checking the soil to make sure it is actually dry before you give them water again. All right, next tip, avoid exposing your houseplants to extreme temperatures. You want to keep them away from cold drafts or hot air vents. And this is because sudden hot and cold can cause stress to a plant. It can cause burnt leaf tips, etc. How to go around this, keep them away from cold windows as much as you can, and try to keep any leaves from touching the glass of the window. You're putting your plant at risk of freezing those parts of the leaves that are touching the window, because as we know, our windows get really cold. And then if they're by a vent, maybe try and scoot them away from the vent so they aren't in like the direct line of that hot air coming out at them. Next tip is to pay attention to the sun. So the sun is lower in the sky in the wintertime for those of us in the northern hemisphere, and it may be shining into your windows differently than it did in spring and summer. For me, I'm getting a lot more direct sunlight in my south-facing windows. And so if you need to, you can adjust where your plants are sitting so that they can still enjoy bright and direct sunlight, or you can be adding artificial lights if maybe some of them aren't getting the light that they used to. A lot of the plants that I have down low, they aren't getting any high sun kind of streaming straight down into my window. And so those, I've kind of had to get artificial lights for those guys that are down low and they aren't getting that sun. And if they are getting direct sun, don't worry about it too much. The sun is less intense in the winter time, so a bit of direct sunlight in the winter usually does not harm them. If you do notice adverse effects like leaf burn, you can try moving them around and see if that helps, and turn them frequently to ensure growth all around. And it's not just shooting towards the sun one way and is really lopsided. All right, I do have more tips. I'm going to take a quick pause and we will get to the rest of these tips right after this break.
Listen to the 48 Hours podcast for shocking murder cases and compelling real-life dramas from one of television's most watched true crime shows. Go behind the scenes of each episode with award-winning CBS News correspondents and producers in Postmortem, a weekly deep dive. Listen to 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, we're back and jumping right into some more tips for getting your plants to thrive during the wintertime. Next tip is to stop fertilizing. Because most houseplants are slowing down their growth in the wintertime, they don't need the extra boost of nutrients from fertilizer. It's more likely to lead to fertilizer burn since they aren't uptaking it quite as fast. And you can resume it in the spring and summer when you notice lots of new growth. I will say this, and I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, that these are general guidelines because there are some vines that keep growing really strongly in the winter. And if you notice this, you're welcome to keep feeding these plants, keep fertilizing them with a more diluted fertilizer because fertilizer is really just aiding in new growth. So a lot of people, sometimes they feel like in the winter time, they're getting a lot more of that direct sunlight onto their plants because the sun is streaming in differently. And yeah, if you notice lots of new growth happening, if they're really taking advantage of that sun that's now coming in on them, you can keep fertilizing. That is totally fine to do. Just make sure that you read the label, that you dilute it so that you don't burn your plants by fertilizing them too much. And if this ever happens, you'll notice this in fertilizer burn, and that shows up in like crispy leaf tips or just burnt leaves altogether. They will start to go yellow very suddenly. And you can stop this burn from happening by placing your plant under running water and letting the soil just have running water going through it. You are flushing out those extra nutrients away so that they will not continue to basically burn your plant from all those extra nutrients. Next tip is to watch for pests. If you have had your plants outside for the summer, when you are bringing them in, be checking for pests. Even before you bring them inside, check for pests. Maybe put them in a corner where there are no other plants so you don't risk spreading pests onto them. And then for those of us who have our houseplants inside all year round, just be aware that pests can kind of flare up in wintertime, even if you haven't taken them outside. And one thing I've noticed, since the soil takes a little bit longer to dry out, they aren't taking up water as fast. Fungus gnats can be a problem. So using sticky traps, maybe a bowl that has a bit of vinegar, water, and dish soap in it can really help. The flies are attracted to the smell of the vinegar. They hop in there and they get stuck in that solution and die. Or you can use some other method that you like to get rid of fungus gnats. One time I resorted to using a vacuum because I was so sick of them and I just wanted to suck them all up. It worked okay. I would definitely recommend that if you do vacuum them, use other methods as well. And then on the flip side, having really dry and warm conditions in our home, right? Because we have the heater going, wintertime is a lot more drier, and that creates perfect conditions for things like scale, aphids, or spider mites, especially spider mites. They love hot and dry. So just be checking under leaves every now and then and treat those pests appropriately. But speaking of having dry air in the wintertime, this leads us to another tip. And that tip is to use a humidifier. And you can use it all year round, but especially in the wintertime, it's really needed because your home drops about 10 to 20% in humidity levels from the cold, dry air, and plants can deal with pests, crispy leaf edges, etc. from the low humidity. So things to help this, obviously you can get a humidifier, right? You can just go buy one. There are many that are relatively inexpensive. You can use a pebble tray, which is super easy to make. It's just a dish filled with pebbles, marbles, something, and you fill it with water and set your plant on top of that. The pebbles are there to kind of keep the roots up and out of the water, and as it evaporates, it creates more humidity for your plant. Another thing you can do if you don't feel like doing any of those is you can clump your plants together. I'm sure you guys know this, but plants, they transpire. That means water is coming out of their leaves via their stomatas, those little pores on their leaves. And so it is a little bit more humid around them. So if you clump them together, it creates a more humid environment and they can all benefit from that. The one thing I will say that I don't recommend to help with humidity is misting your plant. It just doesn't work for the long term. It mostly makes you feel good, which you can do it if it makes you feel good. That doesn't matter. But if you're trying to really increase humidity for a long period of time, it's not the best way to go. I actually saw recently, I believe it was an Instagram reel, and someone had a humidity meter and they set it there right next to their plants, and then they misted the plants and humidity, went up very quickly. And I think they had it on a time lapse and it took about 3 hours for the humidity level to be completely back to where it was before misting. So yeah, it works, but for a really short time. I don't know very many people who want to be misting their plants every 3 hours, every hour. It's just not reasonable. Or maybe it is. Maybe you just want to sit around and mist your plants forever. But I don't. I would much rather use a humidifier. So just choose something that works for you. But just know that misting is not a really reliable option for long-term humidity. I have a few more tips for helping houseplants in the wintertime. So my next one is to keep the foliage clean, the leaves clean. And this is because your plants aren't getting as much sun. They need to be able to utilize all the sun that is coming in and really be taking advantage of that. So if you get a microfiber cloth or some other gentle cloth, you can use water mixed with neem oil or just plain water and wipe them down gently. Or you can put them in a shower and turn the shower on and kind of wash them off. That way, get the dust gone. And this can really help your plants utilize the sun that's coming in because our homes, they get dusty. It's just a fact of living in a house. So wiping them down is always a great idea, especially in the wintertime. If you do have plants that have little fine hairs, something like a prayer plant, do not use a cloth to wipe them. It can damage them and it doesn't really work, but you can use a gentle brush to kind of brush off any sort of dust on these plants and go about it that way. You can also do this for other plants that are a little more grabby, like a cactus, or there's other succulents that can be a little grabby with a microfiber cloth. So using a brush can work really well for those. Next tip is to wait to repot your houseplants until spring or summer. And this is just because plants bounce back best from repotting when they are actively growing, like they do in spring and summer. So if you do notice them actively growing, they seem to be doing great in the wintertime, you can probably repot them and it'll be okay. But for most people, the growth slows down, and so that's why we don't recommend repotting. It could even shock some houseplants because some do kind of go into a dormant stage, and you don't want to be messing with them while they're in that dormant stage. And last tip I have is to hold off on pruning and propagating. And this just kind of goes along with having the plant having a hard time bouncing back from stresses. By holding off on pruning, you are keeping that stress basically away from them. It'll have a harder time putting out new growth during this time of year, unless, like I said, you notice that it's growing like crazy in the winter, then you can probably prune it just fine. But removing yellowing or dead leaves, that's totally fine. Do that any time of year. It does not matter. And propagations, the reason why I say it's best to wait on that is just because they take a much longer time to grow quickly if you are simply relying on the natural sunlight coming into your home. But if you have artificial lighting or if you have heating mats, that can really help your propagations keep up on a quicker rate. The cold and lower lighting just makes them take a while. So maybe it's more of a caution on propagation that they just take a while than they would in the summer or the springtime. But you don't necessarily have to stop doing them. It's fine to keep doing them. They'll just be a little longer. And with that, that was my last tip for how to help your houseplants thrive in the wintertime and adjust. I hope this episode was full of a lot of good reminders for you as a houseplant owner, and I hope that you guys learned something new today. Just a quick reminder, go ahead and share this podcast with someone and message me on Instagram at tinnyplants or email me at tinnyplants@gmail.com. I'm really excited to have you guys be here for episode 100, and I will talk to you guys next week. Thank you for being here and listening today, and I hope you'll join me next week. If you'd like to support this podcast and keep it going, you can find the support link below in the description and donate. Or I have some awesome Plant School merch, including stickers, shirts, and mugs, and the link to my shop is in the description as well. And if you don't want to spend any money but still support the podcast, share this podcast with a friend, either verbally or electronically. This will even qualify you for my giveaway. Just message me on Instagram at tinnyplant that you shared the podcast with a friend, and you'll be entered in for a chance to win some goodies. Winners will be announced on the podcast. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great week.